Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of the United States and the Cold War. I concluded the previous lectures with the observation that the Korean War saved NSC 68 and its authors. NSC 68, which called for a far more aggressive response to communist expansion than the more defensive policy of containment, needed a conflict like Korea to drive home the threat that communism was indeed on the march. So in June of 1950, when North Korea invaded the South, only 2 months after NSC 68 was presented to President Truman, it seemed to validate everything the authors of the report claimed. Thus, in order to stop the communist menace from consuming Korea and to stop the next domino from falling after China, the United States was compelled to intervene. In this lecture, I'll begin the discussion by talking about the background of the Korean War. The Korean War has sometimes been called the Forgotten War, and for Americans it does seem to take a back seat to the other wars that bookended World War II and the Vietnam War. World War II is more celebrated for obvious reasons. It was much larger and involved both a clear enemy and a clear victory. Vietnam is probably better remembered because it was so controversial, lingered for so much longer, and had a more profound impact on the home front. Yet the Korean War should not be forgotten. It led to an almost equal number of American casualties as the Vietnam War, and in a much shorter time. For the soldiers who fought it, the suffering was immense, as the conditions were extremely cold and difficult, and they endured all the same kinds of wartime trauma as their fellow veterans of World War II and Vietnam. The Korean War had sweeping ramifications that shaped policies on both sides for decades after it ended, and indeed continues to have an impact today. And it should be noted, the Korean War is really only overlooked in the United States. For those in other parts of the world, and most especially Asia, the Korean War is hardly forgotten. The origins of this war, as with much of what we've discussed already in the course, lie in the World War II years and even earlier. Korea had been under Japanese control during World War II, and after the war, it was divided into North and South at the 38th parallel by virtue of the Cairo Conference in 1943. The northern half was under the influence of the Soviet Union, while the southern half was under the influence of the United States. While these lingering Allied forces eventually withdrew, neither side wanted to see a unified Korea fall to the other. As the ideology of containment heated up in the years after the war, Korea became an object of concern. The United States wanted to make sure that it didn't fall to communism, and as noted, the fall of China in 1949 suggested that this might be the next domino to fall. In 1948, the newly created United Nations sponsored elections in Korea, which were rejected in the north and were won by Syngman Rhee, who assumed control in the south. I'll talk more about him momentarily. At that point, the Republic of Korea, the ROK, was created in the south, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which, by the way, was not democratic, the DPRK, was created in the north. Leaders on both sides hoped eventually to unify the nation and rule over one Korea. Thus, both leaders might be called nationalists first and foremost. If you look at Korea on the map as well, notice that it's overshadowed by China to the north. But also, in the far upper right-hand corner, you might notice that North Korea even borders with Russia. So this became a very touchy situation, and as things evolved, the possibility of incursions by the Chinese and or Soviets made this a particularly important situation. The regional divisions in Korea date back long before the official division at the 38th parallel. And much as one might note that in the United States, the North is quite different from the South, culturally, economically, socially, and things were similar in North and South Korea. North Korea was historically a more rural region, rooted in agriculture with a harsher climate than the South. Its people tended to be more isolated, and most were farmers or poor peasants. As such, the North was drawn more to communism as that global movement grew. The North was led by a young and charismatic leader named Kim Il sung. Kim had been born into a Protestant Christian family and was well educated. He fought against the Japanese during their occupation during World War II, and in 1940 fled to the Soviet Union, where he served with their army during the war. He returned to North Korea then, first as a nationalist and second a communist. He became the Soviet Union's man in Korea. In North Korea, he carried out aggressive land reform initiatives, seizing land held by landlords, Buddhist temples, and Christian churches, and distributing it to the poor. While also largely agricultural, the South was more technologically developed and cosmopolitan than the North. It was the site of the largest ports and cities, and thus was more exposed to international influences and a more diverse economy. Many in the South remained poor peasants, but there was also a growing middle and upper class, many educated and influenced by the West. The South was led by Syngman Rhee, an elderly leader who had spent many years in the United States. Rhee was also a Christian and was fascinated with America. He wanted the South to become a liberal capitalist democracy like the United States, and he often wore American clothes rather than more traditional clothes. During Japanese control during the war, Rhee fled to Hawaii, attained an education, and evolved into America's man in the South. As he assumed control in the South, Rhee worked with former Japanese landlords and overseers to assert control. He did not enact land reform as Kim did in the North, leaving many poor in the South unhappy. In the late 1940s, there was considerable unrest in the South, exacerbated by guerrillas from the North sneaking into the South and sowing the seeds of unrest and rebellion among the unhappy Southerners. Rhee clamped down on both the Northern agents and the disgruntled Southerners. By 1948 and 49, the conflict was growing into a civil war. Both North and South sent guerrilla fighters across the border, and skirmishes were frequent. Southern forces deserted in large numbers. Even before United States involvement in this war, it's estimated that more than 100,000 Koreans had been killed in what was a growing civil war. So, historians now think that the Civil War in Korea was just that. It really had little to do with outside forces such as the growing global movement of communism and the Cold War. But under the ideas of containment, and in the atmosphere of that time, Truman and American leadership could only see the Korean conflict in Cold War terms. In other words, a victory by North Korea was a victory for communism, and the United States simply could not tolerate that. As noted in previous lectures, events in 1949 and early 1950 raised the level of urgency in the Cold War immensely. In 1949, China fell to communism. Many feared that this was the first domino to fall, and so other nations had to be prevented from falling to communism. Containment and the Truman Doctrine were being put into effect. In 1949 as well, the Soviets tested their atomic bomb. And in early 1950, NSC-68 was presented to Truman. Not long after that, North Korea invaded the South. So while this was in fact a civil war, and the United States was not obligated to intervene, With the blinders of the Cold War and what Truman perceived to be the global threat of communism on the march, he felt no other choice but to intervene on behalf of the South. In the next lecture, we'll examine the growing war in Korea and United States involvement.